I once believed no pain from family could ever destroy me, until the day I received a mortgage notice nearly $1 million signed by me. Except I never signed it. And the person who did it was the daughter I raised with my own life. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to follow more true stories that cut straight to the heart. A chill had crept into the Vermont air that morning, the kind that warned of leaves turning and endings looming. Lorraine Miller pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto her creaky front porch, a steaming mug of black tea warming her hands. The woods surrounding her cabin whispered in wind-stirred hushes, and somewhere in the distance a crow called once and went silent. It was a morning like any other, until it wasn't. On the small table beside the rocking chair sat a thin pile of mail, mostly junk catalogs. She never ordered coupons for products she didn't use envelopes with her name misspelled. But one envelope stood out, clean, white, crisp, embossed with the blue seal of Fairview National Bank. Lorraine's fingers hesitated. She hadn't done any banking with Fairview in decades. Her modest pension was deposited into a local credit union, and she rarely used anything more complex than a checking account. She frowned, set her mug down, and slid a fingernail under the flap. A neatly folded document emerged heavy with corporate formality. She scanned the first line, then the second. By the third, her breath caught. Dear Mrs. Lorraine Miller, this is a final notice regarding the overdue payment on your mortgage loan account, number 3827416. As of September 15th, your second monthly installment of $14,820.39 is 30 days overdue. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. Her fingers trembled. She dropped the letter. The paper floated to her feet like a dead leaf, final and uncaring. Lorraine stared at it, heart thudding in her chest. Mortgage foreclosure. Her cabin, her home, her sanctuary was already paid off decades ago. She and Henry had built it together from reclaimed timber the summer after he retired. No one touched this land but her. She bent down, picked up the letter, and continued reading. Loan amount, $1,200,000. Origination date, April 15th of this year. Collateral property at 119 Timber Hollow Road, Vermont. Borrower Lorraine Miller. Signed in person at Fairview National Denver Branch, Colorado. Lorraine blinked. Colorado. She hadn't left Vermont in nearly 3 years. Not since Henry's passing. She barely went to the town center anymore, much less across the country. There was a photocopy of a signature attached, her name scrawled across a line in neat blue ink. It resembled hers, slightly, but not quite, like a ghost version of her handwriting, too clean, too practiced, too impersonal. She stared at it for a long time. It was still early, but the urgency in her gut made her move faster than she had in months. She went inside her tea left forgotten on the porch and fumbled for the old cordless phone. The numbers on the letter were precise. She dialed the 800 number for Fairview National, her hand trembling as the automated voice gave her options. If you are calling about mortgage account information, press 2. She pressed 2. A long wait, classical hold music. When the line finally clicked, a young woman's voice answered, too cheery for Lorraine's mood. Fairview National Mortgage Services. This is Carla speaking. How can I help you today? Lorraine cleared her throat. Yes, this is Lorraine Miller. I received a letter from your bank this morning. It says I've missed a payment on a mortgage loan, but I've never taken out a loan with Fairview. I think there's been a mistake. Let me pull up your account, ma'am. Can you verify the loan number? Lorraine read it aloud, her voice growing steadier. There was a pause on the other end. The soft clicking of a keyboard. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Yes, I see the account here. It was opened in April on the 15th at our Denver, Colorado branch. 30-year fixed-rate mortgage loan total, $1.2 million property listed as your home address in Timber Hollow. payments of $14,822.39 due monthly. It shows the first payment was made in May, the second was missed. That's why you received the notice. Lorraine inhaled sharply.
But I didn't open that account. I wasn't in Colorado. I haven't been in Colorado in decades.
Another pause. Well, our records show in-person signature verification. Mrs. Miller, we have scans of your ID, your Social Security card, even your last 3 years of tax returns. The signature matches the driver's license on file. That's not possible. I understand this is upsetting, ma'am. If you believe this loan was opened fraudulently, you'll need to come to our branch in person with your identification and file a formal dispute. We also recommend you contact local authorities. Until the matter is resolved, you will remain liable for the payments. Liable. That word hit her like ice water. She thanked the operator in a daze and hung up. The cordless phone slipped from her fingers and hit the table with a thud. Lorraine stood there for a long moment, the echo of the word liable buzzing in her ears. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind. The cabin walls, thick with history and quiet comfort, suddenly felt paper-thin. Someone had used her name, her information, her life, to secure a loan she never asked for, $1 million, against the only thing she truly owned. She thought of the attic filled with old photographs, Henry's books still stacked on his nightstand, the rocking chair where she used to knit winter scarves. The idea of strangers prying into that space, repossessing it, stripped her breath away. Her knees buckled slightly as she sat down. She blinked hard and rubbed her temples, trying to steady her breath. Who would even want to? Her mind chased itself, spinning in frantic circles until it landed hard on a name. Eliza. The name hit like a slap, a shadow across her heart. Lorraine hadn't spoken to Eliza in months, not since their last phone call, which ended in polite tension. Eliza had been too busy to visit, consumed with her growing real estate company out west. She'd stopped sending birthday cards, never returned Lorraine's voicemails. But that had become the norm. It was part of growing old, she told herself. Children get lives, they forget. But this wasn't forgetfulness. This was theft. This was betrayal. No. Lorraine shook her head. She couldn't jump to conclusions. It could be anyone, a stranger, a hacker, a coincidence. But her gut didn't believe that. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, scattering leaves across the porch like spilled secrets. Lorraine stepped outside again, the letter clutched tightly in her fist. The breeze tugged at her cardigan. She looked down the gravel path that led into the woods, the same one Henry used to walk every morning before coffee. How do you start to undo a lie this big? The sun was low now, a muted gold spilling through the trees. She eased herself down into the rocking chair and stared out at the horizon, the envelope resting in her lap like a live wire. Her fingers traced its sharp corners. One wrong move, and everything she built could unravel. But Lorraine Miller had been a nurse for 40 years. She'd held hands through death-delivered babies on snowy nights, fought through grief and loss and the hollow silence of widowhood. She wasn't going to let this happen, not quietly. She rocked slowly, the chair creaking beneath her, her face set in determined stillness. The war had come to her doorstep wrapped in a white envelope with a blue logo, and she was going to fight. Because there are some things too sacred to let go without a fight. Like your name, like your home, like your dignity. Lorraine looked out at the trees again, the golden haze of dusk settling across the yard. Her journey had begun. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a pair of old reading glasses she hadn't used since Henry's funeral. Her tea had gone cold. The letter from Fairview sat in front of her like a corpse waiting for a name. She flipped it over again and again, as though an answer might fall out if she turned it enough times. The wind had picked up outside. It whistled faintly through the cracks of the old cabin, brushing the edges of memory. $1 million loan. Her name, her signature, her life reduced to a string of forged paperwork. She pushed the envelope aside and opened the top drawer in the buffet hutch where she kept her personal documents. Her fingers rifled through folders labeled in neat block letters, taxes, medical, house insurance. Everything was in order. No missing documents, no evidence of intrusion. She moved to her filing cabinet. the one Henry had built from oak. Inside, Will's birth certificates, her old nursing license, Henry's military papers. She dug through them all, heart pounding harder the deeper she went. Nothing. Nothing missing. No credit card accounts opened. No change of address forms. Nothing out of place. And yet someone had taken her name and sold it like a deed. Lorraine leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under her. Her eyes drifted to the dusty bookshelf across the room. Above it, a small framed photo of a girl with long auburn hair and green eyes smiled shyly beneath a row of sunflowers. Eliza. The thought came gently, then flooded in with violent force. Eliza Caldwell. The name she'd spoken fewer times in recent years, but which still lingered like a note in a song you don't realize you know until you hum it in the dark. A heavy silence fell in the room. Lorraine reached for the photo frame and cradled it between her fingers. Eliza at 9, the year Lorraine had brought her home from Ridgebrook Foster Center. The girl had been silent for the first 3 days, wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat. Lorraine remembered sitting on the floor next to her bed, reading Charlotte's Web aloud, while Eliza stared at the wall. On the 4th night when Charlotte died, Eliza began to cry, and never stopped talking after that. Lorraine had raised her like blood. Nursed her through childhood fevers, braided her hair, before school dances, sat front row at her high school graduation. She paid her tuition at the University of Denver, business major. Full ride, but Lorraine had still sent care packages, socks, snacks, a little handwritten note every week. And then, the slow fade. After graduation, Eliza moved west, said she had projects. Lorraine didn't pry. When you love someone like your own, you let them fly. But what if they fly too far? She turned to the old desktop computer in the corner of the living room. It was a clunky thing, bought second-hand at the church bazaar, barely fast enough to load the news. Lorraine powered it on. The screen flickered to life. It still had Henry's login photo, a sunset over the marshes. She opened the browser, fingers hesitant on the keyboard. She typed Eliza Caldwell. The first few links were old social media profiles. A dormant Facebook page with a graduation photo, a LinkedIn that hadn't been updated in years. Then something caught her eye, a new headline. Eliza Caldwell, the visionary behind Caldwell Capital. Lorraine clicked. The page loaded slowly, the Wi-Fi chugging like a winded horse. There it was, Eliza standing in front of a half-built luxury condo with a hard hat and designer sunglasses. The caption read, "Denver-based investor Eliza Caldwell is quickly making a name for herself in the high-stakes world of mountain real estate. Her latest acquisition, a 15-acre parcel near Telluride, for $6.8 million, funded by strategic private lending." Private lending. Lorraine's throat closed. She scrolled down. Photo after photo. Eliza sipping wine on a rooftop deck, cutting ribbons at groundbreakings, speaking at finance summits. She looked older, sharper. The sweet, hesitant girl from Ridgebrook was gone. In her place, a woman in heels flanked by men in tailored suits. She clicked another article, then another. A pattern emerged. Every property listed under shell corporations. Every loan arranged through personal relationships with key financiers. And one photo in particular made Lorraine's heart drop through her chest. Eliza seated at an event in Aspen. Behind her on a presentation slide was the Fairview National Bank logo, the same logo on the letter. Lorraine's pulse was pounding now. She opened a new tab and typed Caldwell Capital plus Fairview National. Multiple hits. Fairview had approved at least 3 loans for Caldwell Capital over the past 18 months. Projects in Aspen, Boulder, Fort Collins. The language was always the same, secured by trusted personal backers. No names ever listed, but Lorraine knew hers was among them. A dull ache filled her chest. She stared at the screen, fighting the hope that wanted to wriggle free. Hope that maybe this was a mistake, a clerical error, that maybe Eliza wasn't involved directly. She opened her email and typed Eliza's address. A few drafts from years ago, never sent, appeared. She deleted them, then typed, "Call me. Urgent." She hit send. No reply. She waited 10 minutes, then tried her number. Straight to voicemail. the same chirpy recording. "Hi, you've reached Eliza. I can't come to the phone right now. Leave a message and I'll get back to you soon." Lorraine didn't leave a message. She tried again, still nothing. She stared out the window, the light beginning to dim. Her reflection met her gaze in the glass-creased pail, startled. She reached up and touched her face as if trying to wake from a dream. Then she opened Eliza's Instagram. It was set to public. There, in crisp, curated squares, Eliza, hiking a red rock canyon. Eliza lounging beside a fire pit at a resort spa. Eliza on a balcony with snow in the background and a caption that read, "Rise, grind, own it." The geotag said Telluride, Colorado. Lorraine let the tablet fall to her lap. The photos were recent, all within the past 2 weeks, and everyone radiated the kind of wealth Lorraine didn't know Eliza possessed, not from a social worker's salary, not from student debt, unless she borrowed it in someone else's name. Lorraine's hands trembled as she stood and crossed the room to the cabinet above the fireplace. She opened the wooden box inside. Henry's glasses, his army ring, a flash drive, a notebook labeled passwords. She flipped it open and scrawled down every digital trace of Eliza she could find, every company name, every press release, every phone number, every detail. She was going to Colorado. No, not yet, not without more. But she would find out what was going on, and if her worst fear was true, if Eliza had done this, then Lorraine would be forced to face a truth more painful than losing her home. She would have to face the fact that love might not be enough. Outside, the wind battered the porch as twilight descended. Lorraine shut the computer down and lit a single lamp by the rocking chair. She sat slowly, letting the weight of the day settle onto her shoulders. She had loved that girl like her own, and maybe that's what made it hurt the most. Not the loan, not the fraud, but the silence. The fact that Eliza didn't even ask, just signed her name in the dark. The morning after Lorraine had seen the photos, she dressed in her gray wool coat, the one she hadn't worn since Henry's funeral, and stepped out into the pale light of a brisk Vermont morning. The mist clung to the road as she drove slowly, carefully toward the local Fairview branch 30 miles away in Bennington. The whole way she rehearsed what she'd say, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Inside the bank, everything smelled sterile bleach and old carpet. At the front desk, a young woman with an overly cheerful smile greeted her. "I need to speak with someone about a fraudulent loan taken in my name," Lorraine said plainly. The woman blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," Lorraine replied, her voice suddenly hard as iron. "I need a supervisor. Now." 10 minutes later, a man in his 40s with a receding hairline and an apologetic tone led her to a private office. His nameplate read D. Haverly. Lorraine handed him the letter she'd received. He skimmed it quickly, eyebrows climbing higher with each line. "Let me pull up the file," he said. The screen lit up with a familiar shade of blue. Her name, her address, the amount. Lorraine watched in stunned silence as he opened the digital contract. "Here's the signed agreement," he said, rotating the screen toward her. Lorraine leaned in. There it was, her name scrawled in black ink across the bottom of a multi-page document. "That's not my signature," Mr. Haverly frowned. "Do you have an ID with you?" Lorraine handed him her Vermont driver's license. He compared it to the scanned ID attached to the application. "It's the same photo," he said. "Exact image. Even the glare on the corner is identical." "That photo's from my license," Lorraine said. "Someone copied it. That's not just forgery, it's theft." He clicked through the metadata. "It says this application was uploaded remotely, not in person." "From where?" He paused. "Let me check the IP logs." A few keystrokes later, he turned pale. "That's odd." "What?" "The application was submitted from an IP address linked to an LLC Eliza Capital Group." Lorraine's breath caught. The room suddenly felt cold. "That's my granddaughter's company." He blinked, uncertain whether to express sympathy or concern. "I'll flag this," he said quietly. "But to proceed, you'll need to file a fraud report, and perhaps contact law enforcement." Lorraine nodded stiffly. She stood up, thanked him without meaning it, and left the office. Outside, she made it to her car, sat behind the wheel, and exhaled. Her fingers trembled, her chest tightened. A sharp ache bloomed beneath her collarbone and began to radiate outward. For a second, she thought it might be a panic attack. but the dull throb in her jaw, the sweat gathering at her temples. A heart attack. No, not now. She gripped the steering wheel and closed her eyes, forcing herself to take slow, even breaths. The ache subsided, but not the dread. She drove home with her hazard lights blinking the entire way. By the time she pulled into the driveway, dusk was settling in. The forest around her house breathed quietly wind, rustling the last of the orange leaves. Her hands were numb from gripping the wheel too tightly. Inside, everything felt as she left it too still. She locked the front door, drew the curtains, and made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the same spot on the wood grain. Eliza. Was it possible? Or was she being used too? Lorraine lit a fire and opened her laptop again. She pulled up every trace of Eliza Capital Group she could find. Registered in Colorado under a shell company, her name not listed directly, but the same P.O. box as one of Eliza's photo tags. A coincidence. She doubted it. She began printing out articles, photos, loan documents, anything that mentioned the company or Fairview. She was halfway through organizing them into a folder when the lamp in the living room flickered. The power didn't go out, but something in the air shifted, a creak on the porch. She paused. She hadn't heard a car. Another creak. She stepped toward the window, pulled the curtain back slightly. Nothing. Still, her instincts prickled. 30 years in the emergency room taught her how to trust those feelings. She moved swiftly but quietly to the fireplace and took the iron poker in hand. Another sound this time from the back of the house. A muffled thud. She walked softly down the hallway, heart racing. The door to the study was open. She always left it closed. She entered slowly. The desk had been disturbed. Papers scattered, the printer unplugged. The file folder she'd been using was gone. And her laptop. Gone. Lorraine didn't scream. She stood perfectly still, then turned and checked the windows unlocked. Someone had come in the back. She went to the living room. Her phone was still there. She dialed 911, but she didn't press call. Who would believe her? A 70-year-old woman in a cabin claiming her granddaughter stole her identity and now her computer, and that she had IP addresses and newspaper clippings as proof. Instead, she locked the doors. Every bolt. She dragged the heavy hutch in front of the back door. Then she sat by the fire with the iron poker in hand. The warmth didn't reach her bones. The silence had changed. Someone knew she was getting close, and they wanted to stop her. She dialed 911 the next morning. Her voice was steady, too steady. When the officer arrived, he looked about 23, nervous and half listening. Lorraine offered him tea. He refused. She showed him the folder she had hastily rebuilt from memory articles, emails, bank statements, a printout of the IP address. "Ma'am, it sounds like a family misunderstanding," he said after glancing through it. "If your granddaughter's involved, maybe talk to her. Civil matter. Not really criminal unless you've got proof of intent." "She stole my identity," Lorraine said sharply. "My home, and someone broke into this house last night." "Was anything taken?" "My laptop, financial documents. Any forced entry?" "No, but the window was open." The officer scribbled something, nodded noncommittally, and told her to lock up better next time. He left with a polite nod, nothing more. That night the call came. Her old landline rang at 2:41 a.m. Lorraine sat up in bed, her heart drumming against her ribs. She picked up. The line buzzed, then a voicemail, low and unreadable. "Stop digging, Lorraine. Go back to bed. If you don't, that cabin of yours will be ashes by morning." Then silence. She stood there with the receiver still pressed to her ear long after the line had gone dead. By dawn, Lorraine had made up her mind. She would not call the police again. She would disappear. She packed a single canvas bag, a wool sweater, her father's war journal, a few legal documents she managed to hide under a floorboard after the break-in, a framed photo of Eliza at age 12, beaming in her science fair ribbon. Lorraine looked at it one last time, then placed it gently inside. She left the rest, the teacups, the blankets, the letters from Henry. The house wasn't hers anymore, not really. It hadn't been since the moment someone forged her name under fluorescent light and sent it across the country. She waited until dark, then slipped out the back through the woods. A half-mile hike to the highway, the same path Henry used to take when the truck broke down. Her boots crunched on frost-covered leaves. Every shadow looked like it moved, At the edge of the road, a Greyhound bus hissed to a stop. She stepped aboard, handing the driver a wad of crumpled bills. She didn't ask where it was going. Boston. That's where she got off. For the first 3 days, Lorraine lived at the South Station terminal, a place where no one cared who you were as long as you kept moving. She slept sitting up. She held her bag like a lifeline. Every few hours, security would wake someone to make sure they were still breathing. She watched the faces around her, people in tatters and people in ties, all headed somewhere or nowhere. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. At night, the fluorescent lights stayed on. Her dreams were short, filled with static and fire. On the 4th day, her phone finally died. She didn't recharge it. On the 5th, someone stole the last $40 she had folded in her coat sleeve. She didn't chase them. She just watched. At the end of the week, a woman named Margot, gray hair like smoke and a voice like sandpaper, offered Lorraine a blanket and a carton of orange juice. "You're not from here," Margot said, sitting beside her on the bench. "No, don't worry, none of us are." They didn't speak after that. On day 8, a man walked into the terminal wearing a beige coat and carrying a leather briefcase. He didn't belong there. Not in the way Lorraine didn't belong there. He stood still, scanning the benches. His eyes passed over her once, then again. Lorraine stood calmly and walked away. She ducked into the bathroom, waited 5 minutes, then exited through the side door into the alley. She walked 6 blocks, fast, but not panicked. The man wasn't following her. Probably just coincidence, probably. She found an old church near Dorchester Avenue, doors open. She stepped inside. The place smelled of melted wax and cold stone. A woman in a red shawl stood beside a wooden desk organizing donated coats. Lorraine spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Do you have any beds?" The woman looked at her, nodded. "We have mats and soup." It was the warmest sentence Lorraine had heard in over a week. She slept that night in a church basement. The walls were damp. The soup was watery. But it was the first time she didn't feel like prey. 2 more weeks passed. She worked in the kitchen during the day, chopping carrots for strangers who never looked her in the eye. At night, she read the same newspaper over and over again. Eliza's name appeared in an article on page 6 one morning. Something about a corporate retreat in Vail. Lorraine clipped it with trembling fingers. She traced the photograph. Eliza in designer sunglasses, laughing with someone who looked like a senator's son. "Is she worth all this?" Margot asked, peering over Lorraine's shoulder. She was once. Lorraine knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed help, not from police, someone who understood what was happening. She took the subway to Cambridge and wandered the campus at MIT, places Eliza once dreamed of studying, though she never got in. She remembered an old acquaintance of Eliza's, a boy named Cal, who interned for the Justice Department, who once spent a summer digging into shell companies for a fraud unit. She found his name online in a public database, then his office. He didn't answer her email, but 3 days later, a woman in a dark coat approached her at the shelter. "Lorraine Miller." She nodded. The woman held out a badge. "Agent Harper, Financial Crimes Division. You left quite a digital trail." Lorraine didn't apologize. "I didn't know who else to call." Agent Harper smiled. "Good, because this is bigger than just you. Much bigger." And so Lorraine's hiding ended, not because she was safe, but because she finally knew what she was up against. Lorraine had collapsed near the end of the southbound platform at South Station. One moment she was holding onto the cold steel rail, breathing shallowly. The next, the world spun sideways, and she went down the roar of a passing train, fading into static. She came to with fluorescent lights flickering above her. Her coat was draped over her chest. Someone had pressed a bottle of water into her hand. A woman in her 40s, sharp-featured, dark eyes like glass in winter, crouched beside her. "You all right, ma'am?" the woman asked. "Can you sit up?" Lorraine nodded weakly, her throat too dry to answer. The woman didn't press her. She waited, patient, watchful. 10 minutes later, seated on a bench, Lorraine sipped slowly from the bottle. She expected the woman to leave, but she didn't. Instead, the woman said quietly, "You're Lorraine Miller, right?" That made Lorraine freeze. The bottle trembled in her hand. "I saw your face in a red flag report last month. Internal trigger. It got flagged again when someone accessed a data line linked to Eliza Caldwell. That was you, wasn't it?" Lorraine's lips parted. "Who are you?" The woman reached inside her coat and produced a badge. "Agent Emily Ruiz, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division." Lorraine stared at her. You knew. Emily sat beside her now, their coats brushing. We've had our eye on Eliza Caldwell's investment activity for a year. Multiple properties under shell corporations. Suspicious fund flows from elderly guarantors. You were one of them. I didn't sign anything, Lorraine said bitterly. I haven't left Vermont in years. Emily nodded. We figured as much. You were flagged as a potential victim. Then why didn't anyone come? We didn't have confirmation, not until now. Lorraine looked down at her hands, calloused and knotted with age. I was just going to disappear. Emily's voice softened. You almost did. They moved to a small office in the train station's administrative level, white walls, a coffee machine that hadn't worked since 2019. Emily offered her a protein bar and poured water into a paper cup. Let me explain, she said, pulling out a tablet. On the screen, a flowchart. Lorraine's name was at the top with arrows linking it to companies' bank accounts and real estate purchases. You're one of 4 clean identities being used, Emily said. All elderly, all with no debt history, easy targets. Eliza Capital Group is the front. The money itself, millions, comes from different sources. Some of it's cartel-linked. Lorraine blinked. Cartel. Emily didn't answer. The point is, your name gave them credibility. They used your good record to pass scrutiny. They forged everything. Yes, badly, but just well enough to pass systems that don't care about people. Lorraine's eyes clouded. She was my girl. I gave her everything. Emily tapped the screen. She's not working alone, and I don't think she's fully in control anymore. Silence stretched between them. Lorraine breathed shallowly, the hum of a vending machine the only sound in the room. What happens now? She asked finally. We can protect you. If you help us, Emily said carefully. We want you to continue being the innocent grandma they think you are. I don't want to play games. You wouldn't be. You'd be bait. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. Emily leaned in. You make a phone call. You reach out to Eliza. You ask questions. You act confused. She'll either try to silence you or bring you in. Either way, we track everything. I haven't spoken to her in months. She'll answer. Lorraine looked at the tablet again. Her face smiling, and an old photo sat beneath the words, Trust Beneficiary. A knot of grief rose in her throat. She used to call me Nana Rain, Lorraine whispered. Said I saved her life. Emily didn't respond. Because they both knew saving someone doesn't always mean they'll stay saved. They gave Lorraine a burner phone, a fresh sweater, and a hotel room under an alias, Joan Appleby. The first night she didn't sleep. She stood at the window watching the lights of Boston glow through the mist. She picked up the phone 6 times, put it down every time. On the 7th she called. Lorraine. Eliza's voice, older, sharper than Lorraine remembered, cut through the line like ice. Hi, sweetheart, Lorraine said, voice trembling just enough. I got a strange letter from the bank. Something about a loan I thought I'd ask you. Pause, static. Then sweetly, Nana. That's just a clerical thing. Nothing to worry about. Some account we opened years ago. You signed it, remember, in Denver. I've never been to Denver. Oh, Eliza said too quickly. Well, I can clear it up. I'll send someone to talk to the bank. You don't need to stress. You forged my name? Eliza. Lorraine said softer now. Why? Another pause, then the call disconnected. Within an hour, Emily had tracked the number to a signal bounce out of a resort property in Vail, Colorado. The same property Lorraine's name was on. She panicked, Emily said. That's good. Lorraine slumped in the hotel chair. I don't feel good. Emily knelt in front of her. Lorraine, you just cracked open a case that's been airtight for a year. With your help, we can stop this. Maybe even save her from herself. Lorraine stared at the photo on the wall boats in a harbor that didn't exist anymore. I'm in, she whispered. Over the next 3 days, Lorraine rehearsed. Emily coached her how to sound unsure, how to keep Eliza talking without asking too much, how to let information slip. Don't accuse, Emily said. You're scared, confused, lonely. That part won't be hard, Lorraine said dryly. They practiced the next call. They prepped her bag with a microphone patch, a backup phone, a GPS in her scarf. Emily always stayed nearby, but never close enough to be seen. When Eliza called back, it was on a different number. Nana, I'm sorry I hung up. I was just shocked. Lorraine waited. I'm flying to New York tomorrow, Eliza said. Maybe I can visit. We can talk face to face. Would that be okay? Of course, Lorraine said. I'd like that very much. Emily ended the training session that night with a simple sentence. She's coming. Stay alive long enough to hear what she says. Lorraine nodded. Her hands were steadier now, her breath deeper, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than betrayal. She felt purpose. The safe house wasn't anything like Lorraine expected. No blinking monitors, no steel vaults, no armed guards. Just a modest brownstone apartment tucked between a florist and a closed-down piano repair shop in Cambridge. The interior was sparse white walls, a soft couch, no television. Low profile, Emily explained. The fewer screens, the fewer signals to trace. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea she didn't remember accepting. Her bones ached from running. Her eyes burned from sleepless nights, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. Emily dropped a thick envelope on the table. We traced 4 real estate transfers, she said, all within the past 10 months, all filed under trusts linked to your Social Security number. Colorado, Arizona. One in New Mexico didn't close, got flagged by a local agent. Lorraine reached for the documents, flipping through scans, property deeds, wire transfers, fabricated signatures in looping cursive. That's my name, she said hollowly. Emily nodded. But not your doing. She set down a photo Eliza smiling at a ribbon-cutting ceremony in front of a glossy, sterile condo unit in Aspen. Lorraine's throat tightened. She looks happy. She looks funded, Emily replied. These aren't solo acts. No way she had the capital or the coordination. She always wanted to be more, Lorraine murmured. Even as a kid. She hated being poor, hated that people looked at her like she was disposable. She's not the only one pulling strings, Emily said, pulling out her tablet. We believe Eliza's being used by a laundering operation out of Eastern Europe. Shell companies tied to organized crime, Ukraine, Moldova, even Montenegro. She swiped to a dark screen with blurred call logs and line IDs. And she's in over her head. Lorraine stared at the web of names, dates, and lines like spider silk on the screen. But she chose this, she whispered. Emily's voice lowered. Yes, but she's also being cornered. Later that night, Emily returned from headquarters with a look Lorraine hadn't seen before, tight-lipped urgency. She opened a file and handed Lorraine a pair of headphones. I need you to listen to this, she said. Lorraine did. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Eliza, sharp, controlled. She's asking questions, Eliza said. Too many. She went to a bank. I think they're watching her now. Another voice responded, male Eastern European accent, low and threatening. If she talks, I burn the house, the forest too, you understand me. There was a long silence. Then Eliza's voice, flat and brittle. Yes. Lorraine's hand trembled. She removed the headphones, tears stinging her eyes. She's protecting herself, Emily said, but she hasn't cut and run yet. That tells me something. Lorraine's voice cracked. It tells me she's afraid. Emily nodded. Fear is leverage. We use it carefully. The following morning, Lorraine sat at the window watching a boy with a paper route hurl newspapers with exaggerated flair. How do you live like this? She asked Emily. Constant surveillance, knowing the next doorbell might be a warning. Emily stood beside her. You learn that safety isn't about control. It's about options. And right now you're creating options for people who never had them. Lorraine looked down at the floor. Including Eliza. That's up to her. By midday, the Bureau had linked another account. This one in the Cayman Islands, redirecting dividends from Eliza's condo developments into an art dealership in Prague. The money moves like smoke, said another agent via Zoom. But it always comes back to your name, Lorraine. She's laundering it under me, Lorraine said. Because no one questions a retired nurse in Vermont. Emily's jaw tightened. They will now. They spent the afternoon planning the next contact. Phone's too risky, Emily said. This time you're going to write her. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. A letter? Emily nodded. Handwritten. Like an old woman who just wants to understand. Ask about the house. Ask if she's okay. We deliver it through a mail drop linked to her company. If she responds, we intercept. That night, Lorraine sat at the table and wrote, Dear Eliza, I still don't understand what's happening. The bank won't stop calling. I feel like the walls of this house are whispering things I forgot. If you're in trouble, please just tell me. I'll listen. I'll always listen. With love, Nana. She folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and handed it to Emily without a word. Emily glanced at her. That was good. It was the truth, Lorraine replied. 3 days passed. The silence gnawed at her more than threats ever did. Lorraine started pacing, dreaming of fire and burned paperwork of Eliza as a child slipping through her arms like ash. Then the response came. A voicemail. It had been sent from a burner line rerouted through New Jersey. No traceable ID. Hi, Nana. Got your letter. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to get so bad. I just needed time. I'll be in Vermont next week. I want to explain. I promise it's not what you think. Emily replayed the message 3 times, scanning tone and cadence. She's cracking, she said finally. You've got her hesitating. She's coming to the house, Lorraine said. Emily frowned. That's not safe. Lorraine stood. Then make it safe. The team began coordinating. By the next day, the house in Vermont was under surveillance, drones, motion detectors, and 2 agents disguised as forest rangers monitoring the edge of the woods. You'll stay off-site, Emily told her. If anything feels wrong, we pull her in. Lorraine shook her head. I have to be there. She won't open up to strangers. Emily hesitated. If she brings someone with her, I'll know. You're risking your life. I've already lost enough of it. That night, Lorraine sat at the dining table she hadn't seen in weeks. Dust danced in the shaft of moonlight through the window. She stared at the chair across from her, the one Eliza always took at breakfast, feet swinging, asking if peanut butter was healthy. I don't know who you are now, Lorraine whispered, but I still remember who you were. Outside, a twig snapped in the darkness. Lorraine didn't flinch. She just waited. The meeting was set for a nondescript diner on the outskirts of Denver. No surveillance cameras inside. 1 exit in the front, 1 in the back, and 3 undercover agents seated at tables that didn't draw attention. Lorraine arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a pale blue coat that matched her trembling hands. She hadn't eaten in days, but ordered coffee just to give her something to hold. Her eyes drifted to the rain-streaked windows as headlights cut through the dusk. Her heart stuttered. The door creaked open. Eliza walked in. She looked thinner than her photos. Paler, worn. Her hair tied back, sunglasses too large, as if they were meant to hide more than just identity. She hesitated at the entrance, then spotted Lorraine, and every inch of her body tensed like a cornered animal. Lorraine didn't rise. She just looked at her. Eliza crossed the room slowly and sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of clinking cutlery and soft murmurs from nearby booths filled the silence. The world kept turning, unaware of the war being waged over a cup of lukewarm coffee. I shouldn't be here, Eliza said finally. You are, Lorraine replied. Eliza's jaw worked, trying to hold something back. They're watching. I know. Eliza glanced over her shoulder. Lorraine leaned forward. You used me, she said quietly. You took my name, my house. You took the only thing I had left and sold it to people who would set it on fire without blinking. Eliza's face collapsed inward. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't. You didn't have to, Lorraine snapped. But you did. Eliza reached into her coat and pulled out a crumpled photo. She slid it across the table. It was a boy, maybe 8 years old. Curly hair, dark eyes, a schoolyard in the background. His name's Alex. Eliza, said her voice cracking. He's mine. Lorraine stared. I was 19. I never told anyone. His father's Czech. Things didn't work out. I took Alex with me when I started the business. When the investors came, they found out. She swallowed hard. They used him, Lorraine. I don't know how, but they found out where he goes to school, who his teachers are. One of them sent me a photo of him in the bath, in our own house. A tear rolled down her cheek. I signed the papers because they said if I didn't, he'd disappear, just like that. Lorraine closed her eyes. Her anger met grief in a deadlock behind her ribs. I should have told you, Eliza whispered. But I knew what you'd say, that it's wrong, that it's cowardly. I didn't want to hear it. Lorraine opened her eyes. I would have said, let me help. Eliza looked away. Silence again. Then Emily stepped in. She didn't sit. She simply placed a small envelope in front of Eliza and said, this was intercepted last week. Inside were 6 photographs, all of Alex, taken from a distance, some near his school in Prague, one at a supermarket, one on a swing. Eliza's hands trembled as she looked at them. Her breath became shallow. Her voice vanished. Emily knelt beside her. They're escalating. You know it. We've seen it. The minute you're no longer useful, they'll erase every trace of you and your son. Eliza shook her head violently. You don't know what they're capable of. Yes, Lorraine said, voice like flint. She does. Emily continued, her tone firm but measured. We can protect you. Witness protection, relocation, new identities if necessary, but we need everything: names, transfers, phone logs, emails, every code they made you use. Eliza clutched the photos to her chest. If I talk, I die. If you don't, Emily said, he does. The room shrank. Lorraine reached out, laid her hand on Eliza's. You don't have to be the villain in your own story, sweetheart. You don't have to let them end it for you. Eliza broke. Tears spilled, shoulders shook, years of fear released in a single ragged sob. She nodded. Yes. Back in the safe house, the room buzzed with urgency. Emily debriefed her team. We have verbal confirmation. She'll cooperate. The drop site is in Prague. We'll have to move fast. Eliza sat on the edge of a cot holding a tablet. I'll map out the contacts, the accounts. But some of them I never saw their real names. We'll take aliases, said an agent. Every detail helps. Lorraine watched quietly, then stepped into the hallway to breathe. Her knees ached. Her mind spun. The girl she'd raised had nearly destroyed her life, and now somehow Lorraine was holding her together. Emily followed. You okay? No, Lorraine said honestly. But I will be. She stared out the window. The rain had stopped. A distant rumble of thunder lingered, but the sky was lighter now. Eliza's testimony will make this case, Emily said. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's chosen a side. Lorraine nodded slowly. Then we fight like hell. That night, Lorraine sat with Eliza on the back porch. Eliza held a cup of tea, her eyes red but more alive than before. You saved me once, she said. You didn't have to do it again. Lorraine shook her head. I didn't do it for you. Eliza looked over, startled. I did it for that boy in the photo, Lorraine said, and for the girl who used to ask me if I believed in second chances. Eliza's lips quivered. Do you? Lorraine looked at the stars. I do now. The plan was as fragile as glass and twice as dangerous. Eliza stood in front of the mirror in the FBI safe house, hands trembling as she buttoned her cream blazer. Underneath it, a tiny black wire clung to her skin, running down into the inner pocket. The wire itched, but that was the least of her discomforts. Emily Ruiz stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes sharp. You know the signals? Emily asked. Eliza nodded. If I touch my left ear twice, it means abort. If I say the phrase, we don't rush trust, you pull me out immediately. Good. Lorraine entered slowly with a folded scarf in hand. She stepped forward and carefully wrapped it around Eliza's neck. It was soft wool, faded pink. Once belonged to Eliza's birth mother, Lorraine had kept it in a chest for years. You'll be all right, Lorraine whispered. Just be smart and be brave. Eliza's eyes shone. I'll try. The meet was arranged at a downtown Denver real estate conference, neutral ground. Hundreds of people, easy entry and exit. Eliza walked through the hotel lobby like a woman with nothing to fear. But inside her heart thundered. Two men waited in a private suite upstairs. Mikhail Chernov. Tall, thick hands, long silver ring on his pinky. Former banker turned consultant with connections to Eastern syndicates. And beside him, Jarek Volkov. Thin, beady eyes, silent. The type who'd order a murder with less thought than a coffee. They stood when Eliza entered. You're early, Mikhail said, gesturing to the couch. I wanted to show I'm serious, she replied, settling down. Mikhail raised an eyebrow. After your little panic last week, I wasn't sure. I had to calm the old lady. She was going to the press. Jarek twitched. But it's handled. Eliza added quickly. She's confused. She thinks the bank made a mistake. She's out in the woods feeding raccoons, I don't know. She won't talk. Good, Mikhail muttered. Because if she does, he slid his finger across his throat. Eliza didn't flinch. She pulled out a thick folder. Inside were mock-ups, blueprints for a fictitious property development in Scottsdale, Arizona. Lorraine's name was listed as the investor. All documents are ready. She signs the second phase next week, Eliza said, sliding the folder to them. Jarek opened it, began scanning. His lips moved as he read. Mikhail took a small burner phone from his pocket. And the transfer schedule. Eliza opened her laptop. On screen, a spreadsheet. Dummy numbers, dummy accounts, all coordinated with the FBI. First wire will hit Tuesday, $750K. Second wire Thursday, $850. Totals $1.6 million. Mikhail nodded. Perfect. Eliza held her breath. Then Mikhail leaned closer. She ever gets suspicious about your name being on the deeds. She thinks she co-signed. She's not sharp anymore. Age makes a great shield." They all chuckled. Eliza's spine stiffened, but she smiled. Inside her blazer pocket, the recorder caught every word. In the surveillance van outside, Emily and 2 agents listened in real time. Every laugh, every lie, every dollar accounted for. Emily's jaw clenched when Mikhail mentioned Lorraine's age. "This is gold." He just admitted manipulation of a federal document on tape. The tech officer nodded. "Signal's clear. Backup recording online." Then the voice cut in, Jarek asking, "What about the other old lady?" "What other?" Eliza asked, playing dumb. "The FBI one," he said. "The one that asked questions in Phoenix, tall, Latina." Emily's eyes widened. "Do they know you're talking to her?" "No," Eliza said smoothly. "I haven't heard from her since last year. Why?" Mikhail waved a hand. "We thought she might be a plant, but if she's gone quiet, good." Emily exhaled. Close call. Inside the suite, Mikhail reached into a drawer and pulled out a bottle of scotch. "Celebrate," he offered. Eliza lifted her hand index finger to her temple. A subtle move. Emily sat up straighter in the van. "That's the signal. She's wrapping it up." Eliza stood. "I should go. Don't want to spook the old bird. She still trusts me. I'd hate to ruin that." "You're a good liar," Mikhail smirked. Eliza forced a smile. "You have no idea." She walked to the door. Behind her, Jarek spoke again, voice low, almost thoughtful. "You know, Eliza, you screw us even once. Your son won't make it past Christmas." Eliza froze, then turned. "I'm not screwing anyone," she said, eyes steel, and left. The moment she stepped into the hallway, agents closed in. Not on her, but upstairs outside the suite, a tactical team moved fast. Breach in 5 seconds. Door burst open. Mikhail reached for his burner, and agent smashed it from his hand. Jarek tried to run tackled. 2 more in the bedroom arrested. Fake IDs, cache hard drives, all seized. The FBI had it all. By nightfall, 10 arrests were made across 3 states. Wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, threats to federal witnesses, immigration violations, $9.4 million in assets frozen. In a small room in the FBI Denver office, Lorraine sat beside Eliza as Emily delivered the news. "It's over," Emily said. Lorraine closed her eyes. Eliza broke into sobs. "They had him, his school, his teacher's name, everything." Emily smiled softly. "He's safe. The Czech police picked up a tail 2 hours ago. Your son is under protective custody. You'll see him again soon." Eliza crumbled into Lorraine's arms. For the first time in years, she let herself be a child again, and Lorraine held her. The next morning, the headline hit the airwaves. 70-year-old Vermont nurse helps FBI take down 9mm international money laundering ring. Newspapers, TV, radio. Photos of Lorraine circulated her in a simple sweater, glasses perched low, standing beside Agent Ruiz in front of the FBI building. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like your grandmother. And that was exactly what made the story sing. Lorraine returned to Vermont quietly a week later. The house had been cleaned by agents. The laptop was still missing, but the porch light worked. And someone had planted yellow chrysanthemums at the gate. Inside, everything was as she'd left it. The fireplace, the rocking chair, the photo of Eliza as a child in the hallway. She walked from room to room in silence, then stood in front of the mirror. Her eyes had new lines, her hair thinner, but her spine straighter. She was not a victim anymore. She was a witness, a fighter, a protector, and she had survived. The bus ride back to Vermont was silent. Lorraine sat near the back, her thin coat drawn around her like a shield, the kind she used to wrap around fevered patients long ago in her nursing days. The windows rattled against the wind, each turn of the road a small reminder of how far she'd come and how much had changed. When the bus stopped at the edge of her town, there was no one waiting. Of course not. Her home, once nestled quietly beneath the trees of Rutland Hollow, had been broken into, ransacked, and used as a pawn in a scheme so big it had swallowed lives whole. But it was still hers, even if what remained was just the framework of memory and pain. She walked the rest of the way. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes. A hawk passed overhead, letting out a scream that cut the wind. When Lorraine turned the corner and saw her cottage, her chest tightened, not from fear this time, but a deeper ache. The front door had been ripped from its hinges months ago. The windows were boarded hastily by some local sheriff's deputy. Her garden was dead vines strangling the wooden railings. The smell of mold met her at the threshold, and still she smiled. She stepped over shattered glass, picked up a fallen picture frame of her and Eliza on the back porch taken years ago. Lorraine in her nurse's scrubs, Eliza only 10, hugging her waist. They had planted lilacs that morning. The photo had a crack running through it now. Lorraine ran a finger across the fracture. "This is still my home," she whispered. She spent that night in the only room without a broken window wrapped in a quilt. No heat, just a flashlight and her own stubborn heartbeat. The moon watched through the cracks. In the morning there was a knock at the door. Eliza stood there, hair pulled into a tight bun, no makeup. In her hand a court summons. Lorraine didn't flinch. "I wanted to say goodbye," Eliza said softly, "before I go." Lorraine didn't invite her in, but she didn't close the door either. The two women stood there, an arm's length between them, more distance than the entire country had held when Lorraine had been forced into exile. "I'm serving community time at a shelter in Syracuse, 6 months minimum, no passport, no accounts, no child." She paused on that last word, and Lorraine watched as something inside her crumpled. "I tried to stop them. I really did. But they had everything. Pictures of Ollie at his school, his nanny's name, his route home." "Stop," Lorraine said, not cold, not angry, just done. Eliza looked at her with eyes that still, despite it all, resembled that girl Lorraine had carried in her arms, sick with fever and night terrors, whispering, "Mama, don't let them take me back." "I failed you," Eliza whispered. "You saved me. You gave me a life. And I sold your name for a promise I didn't believe in." "You didn't fail me," Lorraine replied. "You failed yourself." They stood in silence. In the distance, a woodpecker knocked against dead pine. "I'm sorry," Eliza said again. Lorraine nodded barely. "I know." Eliza reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. She offered it hesitantly. "I drew this. In lockup. It's not much." Lorraine opened it after Eliza left. Inside, a sketch, clumsy, pencil-shaded. It was a drawing of their old garden, lilacs in bloom, 2 figures on a porch, one older seated, the other young leaning in to hug her. Underneath, written in small cursive, "Home is where we try again." Lorraine held the drawing against her chest for a long while. Then she lit a fire in the hearth for the first time in months. The smoke climbed upward, curling around the beams like a spirit returning home. Over the next few weeks, Lorraine worked. She cleaned, rebuilt, painted. With each nail driven back into place, a fragment of herself returned. The townsfolk began to notice. The story had traveled fast. Nurse Lorraine Miller cracks a federal laundering ring. They said it with awe. Some with guilt, those who hadn't believed her. Some brought her canned goods. Others offered to help fix the back porch. But Lorraine did most of it alone. One morning she found a note slid under her door. "Your story gave me courage to speak out. My father did something similar to my grandmother years ago. He forged her will. I never said anything. Until now. Thank you. Diane, local school teacher." The note was pinned next to Eliza's drawing above the fireplace. Lorraine stood there that evening, watching the flames reflect in the glass. Her reflection was thin-tired but resolute. She remembered the night she brought Eliza home the first time. The girl had asked for milk and fell asleep on Lorraine's lap, clutching her sweater like a lifeline. Lorraine had stayed up all night, afraid to move. Now, years later, she was alone again, but different. This time she chose it. Later that month, Lorraine stood in front of a panel at the state capitol, speaking on behalf of new legislation, the Elder Identity Protection Act. The bill passed unanimously. She became a public advocate for seniors who had been victims of identity theft, family fraud, or financial manipulation. Reporters asked how it felt to be betrayed by her own blood. Lorraine's answer, "I loved her. I still do. But love without truth isn't love. It's surrender." In a quieter moment, Lorraine returned to her garden. She planted new lilacs, not where the old ones had been, but further out by the woods. She dug deep into the soil, breathing hard, letting the earth stain her hands. And when she finished, she sat there, knees to chest, staring at the patch of dirt like it held the future. Maybe it did. Maybe healing isn't the absence of pain. Maybe it's the decision to grow around the wound, not despite it. She looked to the sky. There were no answers there, just light, and she let it in. It was early spring when the official ribbon was cut on a modest sunlit building nestled just off a quiet road in Burlington, Vermont. The sign outside read in hand-painted letters edged with gold, "The Light Signature Center." Lorraine stood beneath it, flanked by the state senator and 2 representatives from the Department of Elder Affairs. But it was the dozen elderly residents in folding chairs under the maple tree who made her hand tremble with quiet pride. She was no longer just the woman who survived fraud. She was the woman who turned that darkness into a beacon. The center opened with a simple mission to help senior citizens protect themselves against financial abuse. But Lorraine knew it would be more than that. It would be a place to learn to regain dignity, to rebuild what had been taken. Inside the first class, Lorraine stood before a small whiteboard. Her hands moved with unexpected firmness as she drew a signature line and said, "This is not just ink, it's your voice. And your voice deserves to be heard, understood, and protected." The women and men in the class, many of whom had shaky hands and haunted expressions, leaned forward. One of them raised a hand. "But what if I already signed something I didn't understand?" Lorraine walked to her, slowly touched her shoulder. "Then today," she said, "you learn to never do it again, and to teach someone else." There was something sacred in that moment, and she could feel it in the way they gripped their pens. In the weeks that followed, she held workshops with legal experts, partnered with local banks, and even coordinated visits from the district attorney's office. But perhaps the most powerful change came quietly in the mail. It was a pale yellow envelope with no return address. Lorraine recognized the handwriting instantly. Inside a folded letter and a small hand-drawn illustration. The drawing was simple, just 2 figures walking hand in hand through a wide field. One tall, hunched slightly with a messy bun, the other a child with wild curls and a teddy bear backpack. No color, just soft pencil strokes, but it struck Lorraine with the force of a confession. She unfolded the letter. It read, "Lorraine, you don't have to read this. I wouldn't blame you if you burned it. But if you do, I want to say that I never stopped calling you Mama, even in my head, even when I was doing what I did. There were nights I would wake up and think I was back in the cabin, you humming to yourself as you boiled tea. I was weak. I made deals I didn't understand. Then I kept making them because it was easier than facing what I had done. When they threatened my son, I believed them, and I still do. I don't know if I'll ever be safe, but you made me feel safer than anyone ever did. I am sorry, truly, and I know sorry isn't enough. That's why I'm sending this drawing. It's the only thing I can give that's still mine. You used to say that a child's hand will always remember the one that saved it. Thank you for saving me once. I wish I'd been brave enough to save you too. Love always, even if from far away, Eliza." Lorraine sat with the letter for a long time. She didn't cry, not that day. She framed the drawing and placed it in the main hallway of the center. Underneath it, a small brass plaque read, "Trust is a path you can walk again if you know where you began." That night, she sat alone in her office, the rain tapping against the windows. She looked down at the stack of new intake forms from seniors across the county, and on top of them she found a signature she didn't recognize, a strong, deliberate scrawl from a woman named Nancy Ortega 74, who had been conned by her own son into refinancing her home. Lorraine sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of sadness. It was a sigh of readiness. She picked up the intake file and began to read. Lorraine adjusted the microphone, her fingers trembling slightly, not from nerves but age. She sat in the modest studio of Vermont's Channel 8, surrounded by glowing lights and quiet anticipation. A young anchor smiled at her, cueing the crew. Cameras rolled. A red light blinked on. So the anchor began gently. "You've become a bit of a local hero, Mrs. Miller. What would you say to someone who feels they've lost everything?" Lorraine blinked slowly. Her voice was soft, but it cut like silk. "I didn't lose everything. I just took back my name at the right time." A beat of silence, then applause. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was honest, and it landed like a stone tossed into still water. Back at the Light Signature Center, sunlight poured through wide windows. The hum of quiet voices echoed in the converted town hall, now brimming with warmth. Elderly men and women gathered in circles, some writing, some laughing, some just sitting in shared silence. Lorraine moved through the space like a gardener tending roses gently, patiently, lovingly. At one table, Mrs. Eunice Bartlett, 83, partially blind, struggled with her own signature. Lorraine knelt beside her, placing a hand over hers. "Don't worry about making it pretty. Make it true." Eunice chuckled. "Haven't signed anything in 15 years. My son handles it all. At least that's what I thought." A pause. Lorraine met her eyes. "He used your name, Eunice, but you still own your story." They practiced together. Wobbly lines turned into deliberate ones. Hesitation turned to resolve. For Lorraine, each signature was an act of reclamation, a soft rebellion in ink. Weeks passed. The story of the 70-year-old who helped take down a cross-border laundering ring had gone national. Major news outlets replayed the same line from her Channel 8 appearance. "I just took back my name at the right time." It resonated beyond Vermont, echoing in nursing homes, city councils, and even Senate hearings on elder abuse. But Lorraine didn't care about coverage. She cared about connection. One morning, amidst a mountain of mail, she found a simple cream envelope, no return address. Inside was a letter and a drawing. The handwriting was unmistakable, Eliza's. "Dear Lorraine, I don't know how to ask for forgiveness when I don't even forgive myself. But I wanted to say this before I disappear behind what I've done. You were more than a savior. You were my safe place. I lost that when I betrayed you. But I never stopped remembering the woman who showed me how to plant seeds even in winter. Love, Eliza." Folded inside was a child's crayon drawing. 2 stick figures, a little girl with a ribbon holding hands with an older woman in a red shawl. A heart floated between them, beneath it in jagged cursive, "Mama and me." Lorraine's fingers pressed over the paper. Her breath caught. And for the first time in years, she allowed tears to fall no longer out of grief, but grace. Late one afternoon, she sat again on the porch of her rebuilt home. The repairs were modest. The walls still smelled faintly of ash and varnish. But the view was untouched. Maple leaves scattered across the yard, catching the wind like whispers of seasons past. Her dog, Wren, a quiet mutt she adopted from the shelter post-ordeal, lay curled beside her feet. The radio crackled faintly inside some old Louis Armstrong song, drifting lazily into the twilight. She sipped tea from her ceramic mug. Its rim chipped its warmth steady. A student from the center, young eager, approached with a notepad. "Mrs. Miller, I'm doing a piece for the local newsletter. I wanted to ask, what was the hardest part of all this?" Lorraine didn't look up immediately. Her eyes scanned the horizon where trees met dusk. "The hardest part," she murmured, "was remembering who I was before someone told me I wasn't." The student paused, scribbled that down. "And now?" she asked. Lorraine smiled, slow, gentle, full of earned stillness. "Now I remember the signatures we leave aren't just on paper, they're on people." And that winter, the Light Signature Center launched its first initiative for legislative change, pushing for mandatory financial guardianship transparency for all seniors above 65. Lorraine stood with the committee, quietly fierce, sleeves rolled, voice firm. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a founder, a fighter, a flame kept alive by every name that had ever been stolen, misused, or erased. A year passed. On the anniversary of the exposure, the town of Harrowsfield held a candlelight gathering outside the center. Dozens showed up. Survivors, caregivers, families, teenagers, a few lawyers, a lot of hearts. Lorraine didn't prepare a speech. She just stepped to the small wooden platform holding a lit candle. "My name is Lorraine Miller," she said. "I am 71 years old. I have lost money, time, and trust, but I have found more than I thought possible." She raised the flame slightly. "This candle is for every name that was stolen, and for every light we can still spark." Hundreds of others lifted their flames, the street bathed in soft gold. Final scene. Lorraine on the porch again. A fresh spring breeze lifts the hem of her shawl. Children's laughter echoes from the nearby schoolyard. Wren barks softly, then curls up again. The sky blushed with the first colors of a new morning. A gentle voiceover fades in. "There are some signatures we don't write with a pen, but with an entire life."